Well, welcome to this press event to celebrate the launch of Saints Volume 4. We'll hear first from Elder Hugo. We'll hear first from me. And then we will hear from Elder Hugo Martínez, who is a General Authority 70 and the Assistant Executive Director of the Church History Department. We are so excited with the completion of this 4-volume series. On April 6, 1830, the day the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was founded, the Lord commanded in a revelation to Joseph Smith, "Behold, a record shall be kept among you." From our very beginning, we have been a people who keeps records and looks to history for guidance. Subsequent revelations outlined the duty of the church historian to write a history for the good of the church and for the rising generations, and to keep that history continually. Joseph Smith and other early Latter-day Saints took these charges seriously and began work on a magnificent history in the manuscript books that you see on this screen. The books were eventually published as the multi-volume History of the Church. Stack of books. Time marched forward. The church continued to grow. And eventually work began on a second official multi-volume history. In celebration of the 100th anniversary of the church's organization, Assistant Church Historian B.H. Roberts published the multi-volume Comprehensive History of the Church. These beautiful volumes here. At that time, the Latter-day Saints numbered less than 1 million people, the vast majority living in the western United States. So today, as we approach the 200th anniversary of the Church of Jesus Christ, Latter-day Saints in ever greater numbers live the gospel and build the Lord's kingdom in nations around the world. In all their kaleidoscopic diversity, they strive for unity in Jesus Christ and in his church. And one way that they find that unity is through a shared history, a common spiritual heritage, a legacy of faith, devotion, and perseverance. So in 2010, the First Presidency approved the creation and publication of a third multi-volume official history of the Church. This 4-volume work, which is now available in its entirety in 14 languages, tells the history of the Lord's work in the latter days through the eyes of the Latter-day Saints who lived it. Taken together, these 4 volumes, we believe, create a vast perspective of the 200 years of history of the church. For the past decade and a half, a talented team of historians, writers, and editors has worked on the Saints Project. They've used the vast archives in this building, collected over many generations, as well as records held elsewhere, to tell the story of Latter-day Saints around the globe. Before publication, the books have been meticulously reviewed by historians, writers, global audience members, and church leaders. We had 3 main criteria for Saints. First, the history had to be impeccable. It had to be meticulously researched. It had to be totally accurate. Second, the series had to be a page-turner, driven forward by a narrative of individual Latter-day Saints seeking to understand the will of God for their own lives and making history in the process. And third, the volumes had to meet the needs of all Latter-day Saints around the globe, particularly those who we call the rising generations, young adults, and those relatively new to the church. Each volume ends with the dedication of a temple, as you see here, a symbol of Latter-day Saints' commitment to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Volume 1 ends with the temple in Nauvoo, Illinois, in which the saints sealed their families together and received spiritual power before they abandoned the building for their trek across the American plains. Volume 2 ends in 1893 with the temple here in Salt Lake City, now being stabilized so it will stand many more centuries. Volume 3 ends in 1955 with a temple in Switzerland, an important indication of the church's growing global presence. And Volume 4's cover contains multiple temples in continents around the world: Sao Paulo, Brazil; Mexico City; Accra, Ghana; Hong Kong; and Tonga. Taken together, then, they tell the sweeping panorama of the church's past. The subtitle for each of the books is taken from a classic quotation by Joseph Smith, which proclaims how the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ will fill the earth. In Volume 1, the standard of truth, the restoration of the church occurs. No Unhallowed Hand, Volume 2, describes in part the progress of the church amidst great opposition in the days of pioneer Utah. Boldly, Nobly, and Independent, Volume 3, explores the church's global growth in the first half of the 20th century. And Sounded in Every Ear tells the story of how the church became a truly global institution. The Saint series is not just global in its stories, but it's also global in its reach, as evidenced by the 14 languages available today that will make the history available to the vast majority of church members. So unlike many history books, Saints is written as an easy-to-read or easy-to-listen to narrative. It's accompanied by digital articles, videos, other materials that help its audience benefit from insights that history offers. Church history enlarges our memory as a people, inspires us with examples of kindness and courage. And for us as Latter-day Saints, it helps us see what we believe is the Lord's hand as he guides his church. This Volume 4 tells an increasingly global story. It's a story of continuing revelation that helps the church offer the full blessings of the gospel, including temple covenants, to millions of people around the globe. In a foreword to Saints, the First Presidency reminded members of the church, you are an important part of the continuing history of this church. And it is our deepest hope that Latter-day Saints around the world will be able to see themselves in the story and the stories presented here in Saints, and ponder how they can carry on the legacy of faith and service exemplified in our history. We'll now hear from Elder Hugo Martínez.
I'm very grateful to be here this afternoon and to have you here. It's not the most sunny day out there, and it's getting colder, and it's even wet, and yet here you are. I know that this is a very significant and important event for members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints because of what it constitutes. It's the history, the stories of the members of the church in large measure, as well as sprinkled with the history and development of the church since its beginnings, even before 1820. I would like to begin by doing something that I know people here would not like me to do, but I would like to share with you the list of contributors that appears in this Volume 4. So I take executive privilege in doing this. And I just want to say that there's no way, I don't think, that we could count the number of person hours that have gone into this project and the number of people that have gone into it. And I think until we read it and see that all the information that is shared, not only in the printed book, but as well as in the podcast, the videos, and everything else that comes from it, the future discussions, because this is not the end of Saints, we continue writing the story, then that's when we come to see and realize what we find in there. I hope I can identify to you near the end of my remarks, which will be brief because Matt already said everything that we needed to hear about it, and correctly so. He deserved to do that. So we have as apostolic advisors in this Volume 4, Elder David A. Bednar and Elder Garrett W. Gunn of the Quorum of the 12. We have two members of the 70, Elder Kyle S. McKay, who is in Asia on assignment, recording history, writing history, and hopefully not crashing doing it. He's the church historian and recorder, and the executive director of the church history department. And I served as his assistant executive director, and happy to do so. We have managing director of the church history department, Matthew J. Rowe, whom we heard already from, the director of the publications division, Matthew S. McBride, the managing historian for this work, Jed Woodworth, the editorial manager, Nathan N. Waite, the product managers, Benjamin Wood and Petra Javadi Evans, and the artist, Greg Newbold, who showed great resiliency and patience as his painting was reviewed again and again to be more inclusive and actually depict what was the message here. General editors, Scott A. Hales, James Perry, Lisa Olsen Tate, and Jed Woodworth. You'll hear their names repeated. The writers, Scott A. Hales, David Bolingbroke, Lisa Christensen, Angela Hallstrom, Dallin Morrow, David Nielsen, James Perry, Ticia Sai, I hope I'm saying that right, sorry, and Jed Woodworth. And the editors, Petra Javadi Evans, Alison Kitchen Gaynor, Leslie Sherman Edgington, R. Eric Smith, and Nathan A. Wade. And again, countless hours from these and other individuals. I would like to share with you some fun facts, because I like fun facts. So as you heard, Saints is the church's multi-volume history. It's exciting to see the way the volumes 1 and through 3 have been received. Millions have read them, heard them, gathered with them. With volume 4, we tell the story from 1820 through 2020, as you put all those 4 volumes together. So we go from 1955 through 2020. And interestingly, this is my time. I love Saints Volume 4 because there are some people there with whom I have served in different parts of the world. And to know them and then come to see their story here, it just has it's very moving for me. It covers a tremendous period of growth for the church. Church membership shifts from 90% in the US and Canada to less than 50% there, with the growing number of stakes in Africa, South America, Europe, Asia, and the Pacific. The church expands its efforts to relieve suffering and offer hope through humanitarian service, the founding of Latter-day Saint Charities. Technological advances help Latter-day Saints to accelerate the Lord's work as communications bring us together, one world brought together through satellite, churchofjesuschrist.org, Family Search, and the ever-present social media currently. The church goes from 9 operating temples, as was said, to 168, with more announced and still counting. Saints is filled with individual stories, faith-promoting stories, inspiring stories, and the narrative is written in such a way that it draws us into the story. I could not help myself think, wow, what would I do if I was in such conditions? I'm glad the Lord came and taught us the gospel with the help of 2 missionaries when he did. So I didn't have to cross the plains, because Puerto Ricans don't do well in cold weather or snow. And made me wonder and ponder on what really drove them. And my personal insights is that it was being in the presence of a prophet, leading them through the plains, and thinking that families indeed could be together forever. And thus, wherever they were going, they were thinking and following up on the revelations to build temples so that the saints would be able to receive the instruction and the ordinances in temples, so families indeed could be eternal for them. That's what drove them. And when I think of that, I ponder on our own story, my wife Nuria and myself, and we say, well, we did, put the effort to really come to make that become a reality in us. So we were pioneers in that sense for our families and for the church as it was growing in Puerto Rico, where we are from. So our invitation today is for you to have saints and study it and find what we have found there. Stories of people who follow Jesus Christ and find him. We will find our Savior Jesus Christ in the pages and the devotion and the lives that are there. And it's so captivating. I mean, you just can't put it down because all of a sudden they cut the story short and then they bring in another story. And then when will that one continue? And you just keep reading. It's so well done, so well realized, and I'm certain that our Savior Jesus Christ is pleased with us as it will serve the members so very well, and as it will serve all those who read it. Come to an understanding of who we strive to be. I know that that this work will indeed be engaging. I know its words are true. And this I testify in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Elder Martínez. We're happy to take questions collectively, and then we can break out and we'll have some team members available to take questions individually. So those of you online, if you want to submit questions in the chat, they will be relayed here. Or if anyone in the room wants to ask a question, you can just come to the microphone so that it can also be heard online as well. Are there any softballs out there, maybe? Oh, Trent. Go ahead, Trent. Yeah. If you can go to the mic, and then we will find one of us with an answer.
Could somebody talk a little bit about the artifacts that are on display?
I can say something about that. So right in front of me, this bookend was made by a Czech saint named Otakar Vykufka. I challenge you, Trent, to spell that. So he was a saint who converted in Czechoslovakia in the 1930s. And then after the communists came to power in the 1940s, he found himself very isolated, living in, let's see, where was he? Brno. I was going to say Bern. That's a different country. Brno. And so he helped keep the church alive during from 1940s to 1980s. Then during that time, he started to preach the gospel in a non-traditional way, and that was through yoga. And he would introduce general truths to people who were interested in yoga, and then his star pupils, who he felt would be receptive to the restored gospel, he would invite them to come to his apartment and would preach to them from the Book of Mormon. And so what's touching about this is it really represents the miracle of the seagulls and the crickets. He had never been to this place, but he had read about that miracle in 1848. And so this would be one of the teaching tools that he used in his apartment. The handiwork here is from a Latter-day Saint named Julia Mavambela, who comes from South Africa, who converted to the church in 1979. And she was an amazing woman. And we tell her story in 3 scenes in Saints 4.
And Jed, what I love about what this represents is Otakar, of course, was taking inspiration from the pioneer past, right, in a way that we hope saints today will take inspiration from his story, right, those global stories circulating through the church, not just going from the United States outward, but being shared so that the story of Julia Mavambela will inspire people in Brazil and so on and so forth.
Jeff, do you want to mention what's in the cases out here? Just briefly, not in detail, just...
Yeah, sure. So we have 3 cases right in the center of the main room that have 6 stories set from around the world. So all of these stories are in Saints 4. And so we invite you to come when we're done with this presser to go and look at those stories. And we happen to have one of the characters in the book whose story is there in the cabinet here today, Isabella Santana. Thank you for coming. She hails from Mexico, but now she lives locally. So happy to have you.
So I apologize if you've gotten this question a lot, and so you might be annoyed by it. But I have to ask, can we expect Saints Volume 5 in, say, 2070, right? Since 50 years is about the trend, right? So what do you think? Any plans for a follow-up volume, or are we sort of done with Volume 4?
I think the plan for Volume 5 is fine as long as I don't have to write it. If I don't have to write it, then you can do whatever you want. But I do tell a joke. So we take the titles of each of the volumes from the Standard of Truth statement from Joseph Smith. So you see the Standard of Truth, and no unhallowed hand, boldly, nobly, and independent, and then sounded in every ear. So that statement ends with the phrase, the work is done. So I think that seems like a pretty adequate title for Volume 5, appropriate title for Volume 5. So when the time comes and I don't have to write it, I think that would be a great title for it. But I think currently there aren't any plans for a Volume 5 per se.
That said, we are working to extend the Saints brand through what we're calling regional histories, where we're going to work to go into more depth and tell Saints-style stories in the various countries and regions of the world. And in other ways, we're thinking about how we can extend what we've been able to accomplish in this series with further work that we do in the department.
I have a couple for the chat. Okay, let's get, sorry. Okay, Chad Nilsson wants to know, what was the hardest part of writing this book?
I can speak to that a little bit. So I think there are various ways you could answer this question, so I'll answer it my way. I think because my responsibilities were over the literary structure and style, because my focus was on the storytelling aspect of it, I think one of the biggest challenges was trying to figure out how to tell such a big story in so little space. So in Volume 1, for example, we had a very limited cast, a very limited setting, and it wasn't, the Volume 1 doesn't cover that many years compared to the other volumes. And so with each subsequent volume, the cast got bigger, the setting got bigger, and the amount of information that we had to cover in order to make this a representative history was just much larger. And so we had to figure out a way to make the books structurally and stylistically consistent with make this book specifically more stylistically and structurally similar to the previous volumes, while still trying to account for that bigger cast and bigger setting. And so I think that was a real challenge, to try to figure out how to wrangle all the information into the format that everybody's kind of become accustomed to and grown to love.
Could I follow
And
up?
if we should have done this earlier, but we should have introduced the three of you with your responsibilities a little bit better. So Scott Hales.
So yeah, I'm Scott Hales, general editor in the series, one of the general editors, and I function as what we have called the literary editor, meaning one who supervises the style and structure of the series.
And I'm Lisa Tate. I've been a historical advisor and general editor on the series.
Jed Woodworth, general editor and managing historian. I'd like to follow up on what Scott said. You know, when this book opens, we're only in a couple of dozen countries, but by the time it closes, we're in over 150 countries and territories. And so Scott speaks of the challenge of character, but I would say the challenge of country. Anyone around the world who opens this book, they want to see their country mentioned. And unfortunately, we could not mention every country. So we tried to make a story represent a region. So, for example, we have a story set in Peru. We don't have a Bolivian character. We mentioned Bolivia elsewhere in the book briefly, but Peru stands for a story that could be representative of a region, and so on across the world. And so I would say helping every saint see himself or herself in the book, wherever they happen to be, was a huge challenge when you're in 150 nations, without people losing track of the characters.
Yeah, and I'll just say we thought about that question of representation in many ways, not just representation by country, but representation by age, right? We wanted characters of all sorts of different ages by particular circumstances in life or challenges in life, church leaders, in a general sense, Latter-day Saints in the pews, and so that question of representation, trying to think through how can we allow Latter-day Saints to see themselves in these stories.
I would add, too, that it is challenging to write about the recent past. As historians, some of us get into this business because we like working with dead people. And we're working with a lot of live people in this series, which is a great advantage in some ways, because we're able to get the stories, we're able to speak to the people, we're able to follow up. But it's also, and I say that full stop, I'm joking really about the dead versus live person thing.
Mostly joking.
But mostly, yeah. But also it's challenging because we don't have a lot of distance and perspective a lot of the time on what has happened. And especially in the later chapters of the book, we had to choose storylines and so forth based on what we thought were significant milestones, landmarks, things that were going to have some longevity in the church and that, you know, were important. And, you know, it's very possible that there's something that's happened that we didn't really even think about, and 20 years from now we'll be going, well, why wasn't that in Saints Volume 4? That turned out to be really important. So we don't always have the perspective. That's one of the challenges of writing about the recent past. And then I know as well, I wasn't frontline involved in this, but I know that the issue of translation became a very significant thing for us to work through in the course of this project. As Jed says, we're in so many countries. The sources that we need to use to tell the stories are in however many different languages. And so for us to even be able to tell the story, we had to have help with translation a lot of the time to read the sources and be able to tell the stories. So that was a challenge, but it was also a great joy and a great blessing, and we saw a lot of miracles in the way that the sources came together for us in this project.
Another question from Emily Ashcraft. Is the series geared specifically toward members of the church around the world, or would it be a good history for people just starting to learn about the church?
I would say that it could work for both, but you have to be pretty committed if you're just starting to learn about the church to read this. And so primarily we have thought about our audience as Latter-day Saints, people who are in the church, who want to know more about our heritage, who want that connection. But we believe it's been written in a way that it could be engaging to non-members or people just looking at the church.
I fully agree. It's one of the audiences, perhaps, you know, when we had the short histories, Sister Martínez and I read Truth Restored and loved it shortly after our baptism. So, but still, that question has come up in the past, and I do believe that it can be of great help for people to come to know us.
We did try and write the book in such a way, and this is true of all 4 books, that it could be understood by people outside of our faith. But the primary audience is for the rising generation. How do you define rising generation? I would say 16 to 40, somewhere along that line. I also know several people who have read Saints volumes who were not members of a church who got baptized in part because of Saints, helping them work through critical arguments that they had encountered, and Saints helped convert them. So, yes, to that question.
All right. The next question is from Antonio Carlos Lima with the Estandarte da Liberdade in Brazil. He says, the 2025 youth theme for young men and young women in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is Look unto Christ, based on DNC 636, which says, Look unto me in every thought, doubt not, fear not. Saints has the ability to help these young people in their search for Christ through the legacy of faith, sacrifice, and love of many in the history of the church. How can we help young people to awaken the desire to know this history in a more consistent way and to understand the importance of this legacy as they build their own story of faith, sacrifice, and love in their search for Christ?
I can respond to that at first. I think one of the best things that we can do is we can encourage young people to read these books. And if you've got a family, then read the books together as a family. One of the things that I have tried to do at times with my own kids is put the audiobook on as we're traveling with my littlest kids, just to kind of make them aware that this is a resource that's available. And I think another thing to be aware of too is that one of the things that we've done as we've selected stories for Saints is we've tried very hard to identify young people from the church. And so from the very beginning of the series, you can see stories about teenagers or people in their young adult years and their struggles to find Christ in their own life and their desire to seek out truth and to find their way. And I think these are stories that if we have opportunities to, we need to share these stories, and our kids need to be as aware of these young people as they can, because I think that they can serve as role models for the rising generation.
Buenas tardes, soy Iride González de Faro a las Naciones. Es un news outlet en Sudamérica, en Chile específicamente. And I'd be happy to translate my question too. Pero una gran porción de miembros de nuestra iglesia se encuentran en Latinoamérica. Entonces nos gustaría saber qué cosas ustedes tenían en mente al escoger historias de miembros de Latinoamérica. So a large portion of the members of our church are from Latin America. There's so many of us over there, right? So I'm interested in knowing what things do you have in mind when choosing what stories to showcase in the book from Latin American members.
I'm happy to speak to that. So, as I said earlier, we have an issue with the number of countries. And so one of our strategies was to pick anchor countries that are, how would you describe, are without which you cannot tell the story of the history of the church in Latin America. So, for example, Mexico would be a great place to start. We have quite a long arc in Volume 3 about Mexico. We have also a story in Volume 2. But then we decided that we needed at least 2 characters in Mexico in Volume 4, and so we set out to find those characters. But then we have to insert the country into some larger change in the church over time, and that is not easily done. So we're looking for a powerful story that is, we basically have 3 criteria for selecting a story besides country representation. 1, is the story inherently interesting? That's the easiest to find. Most stories are very interesting to the curious, right? 2, is there a sacred angle? Is this story worthy of, say, the small plates of Nephi? And 3, does the story that is an individual, a small story, does it tell some broader picture of change over time in the church, some large movement or change? And so we did that for various Latin American countries. I don't want to give away the story, but we're in Chile, and we're in, I mentioned Peru. we're in Argentina, we're in Honduras, we're in El Salvador. And each of these stories has some interesting, sacred, and large story to tell. Would you add to that?
I would just mention several important Brazilian stories as well.
How can I forget Brazil?
Come on.
Of course, there are going to be. Yes.
Yeah, I think you'll find lots of Latin American stories in these books. I think for me that's one of the most exciting parts of the book, and so I would hope that young people in Latin America would be able to identify with the stories, see themselves in those stories, also see themselves in the stories of young people from Africa and young people from Europe and young people from the United States, right? That sense of identity, that broader identity as a Latter-day Saint.
Thank you.
This isn't exactly an answer to your question, but it occurs to me, as Jed said, we have these criteria for telling the stories, and we've had a lot of people who would come up to us over the years, and my dad was the first missionary here. My mom was the first person baptized. We could have spent the entire book just telling the story of the first here and the first there and the first everywhere. And those are really important stories, and we don't mean to minimize that, but readers may be surprised how little of that we have. We have some, but that was not the criteria or the organizing principle for how we chose the stories that we were going to tell. And where it's appropriate, we've done that, and we hope that that'll be inspirational. But also, as Jed said, we want to really capture the history of the church writ large. And the first this and the first that doesn't always help us do that. So, for what that's worth.
I'm curious, what was the process like for determining which sources you'd make available as the history goes from 200 years ago to right up close to the present?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the vast majority of the sources that we use in Volume 4 are available, right? They're oral histories with individual people. They're journals of individual people that would be available here at the Church History Library or elsewhere. Of course, like any archives, we do have restricted collections, and we have more closed collections the closer you get to the future. I mean, the closer you get to the present or the future. We restrict those as well. But like any organization, there's a need to particularly protect confidentiality the closer you get to the present. So we've been given just tremendous access. That's one of the advantages of writing an official history of the church, is that we've been given tremendous access to even recent sources about the church's history. When possible, we have opened portions of those collections that we have used, and when it wasn't possible, we haven't. So we've tried to be very mindful of that and opening sources that we have used so that they are available to others. But that's not the case with every source that we've used.
I might just add just a little bit, speaking less to that than to the fact that with this volume, more than earlier volumes, we did quite a bit of gathering new sources to tell these stories. So in previous volumes, we were able to rely quite a bit on the collection that we have here at the Church History Library. But for this volume, the team did quite a bit of oral interviews with potential characters, and so we were just gathering a lot of information and sifting through that information to find stories. But I would say that one of the neat things about this volume was the amount of material we were able to gather in and collect for the library.
Yeah, and let me add I'd like to dovetail with something Lisa had said a moment ago, that when you deal with living characters, there is an advantage of finding them and getting answers to questions in real time that you don't have in a written source. So with Julia Mavambela, Our primary source was an autobiography that she wrote with the assistance of a friend. But then we found that her missionary who taught and baptized her was still around. We contacted him, we interviewed him. He gave us great detail about how they came to meet her and all about her attitudes. And so that was very rich. But then we could go back to him, which I did repeatedly when we needed clarification on what South Africa was like, Johannesburg, circa 1979-80. And so a great luxury. I mean, I happen to love living people, Lisa. And so I was much happier to be able to even text. Sometimes I would text with one of our characters and say, was it like this? What were you feeling when you were in the temple? Or whatever. And then we would archive those conversations and cite to them.
Maybe if there's a final question, otherwise we'll make our historians and writers available for follow-up questions afterwards. Please.
So this volume portrays when the church became global. Is there a tipping point in the book, or how was that portrayed when the church population outside of the United States became larger than inside the U.S.? How did you portray that? Or is it a collective telling of the stories? Is that one of the messages of the book?
Yeah.
We're a global church.
Yeah, I don't think we ever stop, and we'll have Scott speak here in a minute. We never stop and say, hey, we're at a tipping point, right? We just tell the stories and show. We try to show the growth through individual characters. Sometimes we'll zoom out and we'll give a snapshot of what's going on and with the church in the region or with the church as a whole to give that. But I think it's more just in the whole book, right? And of course, globalization is a process. I mean, Joseph Smith had a global vision for the church, right? He was sending missionaries internationally very early on. Globalization has always been occurring in the church, and we'll probably look back when some future decision maker decides to sanction Volume 5 of the church and say, we weren't all that global in 2020. Yeah. We sure are more global now, right? So it's just a continuing process.
I'd like to answer your question by mentioning an innovation that we did in this volume that we didn't do in any others. So readers of Saints know that usually a scene is based around a single character. In Volume 4, we have 4 scenes that we call collage scenes. And what they do is, as you might imagine from the word collab, Freudian slip for a Latter-day Saint. Right. The collage concept is we have maybe 6 to 8 characters in a single scene. So we have only a paragraph or 2 about each one. And so we have one on Asia, one on South America, one on the Caribbean, and one in Africa. And it's a way of updating readers at a very snappy, fast pace on the great growth going on in these regions. So I wouldn't call it a tipping point, but each of those scenes functions as, wow, a lot has happened in the last decade in this region.
And I was just going to say, when you asked the question, one of the thoughts I had is that, you know, the book opens in Hong Kong, so it opens with a global story. And in fact, many of the stories of the early chapters take place outside of the United States. But there is one scene that comes to mind very early in the book that does, I think, some of the work that you're talking about. And that is that Elder Spencer W. Kimball, and I'm going to get the date wrong, so I'm going to have you correct me.
1959.
1959. He takes a tour through South America, and one of the things that he realizes is that the local church members need to be taking a more active role in leading the church, which means that the missionaries, the American missionaries, the American mission presidencies need to be stepping back. And so you begin to see the church thinking about changing that dynamic and having local members lead out in their regions and becoming really the leading forces there. And so for me, that scene is something of it functions as kind of a catalyst for the greater church growth, this idea that we need to decentralize the church and give more and more responsibilities to those who live in the area and know it best.
Great.
It's great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to everyone for being here. We will now break, and Jed and Lisa and Scott, Elder Martinez and myself will be available for any follow-up questions, as will Petra Javadi Evans, who's one of our editors, and David Bolingbroke and Elder Martinez are available for interviews in Spanish as well.